Elijah Carter, a man of considerable wealth and influence, boarded the plane with a quiet confidence, unaware that the moment he stepped onto the jet bridge, the seeds of a confrontation were already being sown. With his carry-on rolling smoothly behind him, he adjusted his dark suit with practiced ease, the sound of bustling passengers filling the air. A swirl of chatter, the clatter of rolling suitcases and the faint hum of an airport in motion created a busy rhythm, but Elijah remained focused, glancing at his phone to check the time. Everything was right on schedule. As he walked toward the gate, he couldn't help but feel a slight thrill. It wasn't often that he got to experience flying from the perspective of a regular passenger. Today, however, he had decided to put aside his role as the CEO of one of the world's largest airlines and experience his own company's service from the other side of the cabin. He'd built this airline from the ground up, turning a modest aviation company into a titan of the industry. But today, he wasn't flying as the man in charge. Today, he was just another customer. The first-class cabin was a familiar sight, a sanctuary of luxury and modern comfort. The air smelled faintly of fresh leather and subtle cologne, with a soft ambient glow from the overhead lights casting an inviting sheen on the sleek, modern furnishings. Several passengers were already settled in their seats, flipping through in-flight magazines or quietly sipping champagne. Elijah took a moment to inhale, appreciating the tranquility before the flight. It was his space to think, to reflect on the demanding meetings that awaited him at his destination. He glanced down at his boarding pass, verifying that everything was in order, before sliding into his assigned seat. He placed his briefcase beside him, settling back and releasing a small sigh. A brief moment of peace before takeoff. But this peace would be short-lived. A shadow fell across him, and Elijah looked up to see a flight attendant standing in the aisle. She was tall, with platinum blonde hair pulled into a neat bun, her uniform immaculate. A name tag read, Veronica Dawson. She was experienced, her every move exuding the confidence that came with years of service. But beneath that practiced poise, Elijah could detect something else. An unmistakable flicker of judgment in her eyes, a slight curl to her lips that spoke volumes. It wasn't a smile, not really. "Sir," she began, her tone almost syrupy, "I think you might be in the wrong section." Elijah raised an eyebrow, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" She gestured toward the economy section, where a few passengers were still finding their seats. "This is first class," she said, her voice slow and patronizing. "Economy is further back. Let me help you find your seat." Elijah didn't move. He studied her face carefully, noticing the way her eyes flicked down to his suit and then to his polished shoes, as if calculating whether he truly belonged here. "I'm in the right place," he replied evenly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his boarding pass. She snatched it from his hand, barely glancing at it, before letting out a dry chuckle. "You must have booked an upgrade last minute," she remarked, handing it back with an air of condescension. "People like you don't usually sit in first class." Elijah remained calm, his expression neutral, but inside he was already 2 steps ahead of her. He had encountered people like her before, the ones who believed they could judge someone's worth by their appearance. But today, he wasn't interested in immediate confrontation. He wanted to see just how deep her assumptions ran. "Actually, I booked this seat weeks ago," he said coolly, adjusting his cufflinks as he leaned back. Veronica's smile thinned, her posture stiffening. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped back. "Well, enjoy your flight," she said, her voice artificially bright. But her forced politeness didn't fool Elijah. As she turned and walked away, he could almost hear her muttering under her breath. Unbelievable. A young flight attendant named Grace, who was assisting her in the galley, glanced up curiously. "What's unbelievable?" Grace asked. "Just another one of those people who think they belong in first class," Veronica scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You can always tell when they don't belong." Grace frowned. "But his ticket is valid, right?" "Sure." Veronica waved it off dismissively. "But you can always tell when someone isn't really first-class material. He probably used miles or got some last-minute deal. Either way, I doubt he's used to this level of service." Grace was quiet for a moment, recognizing the tone of disdain in Veronica's words. "If his ticket is confirmed, that's all that matters," she finally said. Veronica smirked, unconcerned, and turned away. "Let's see how long he lasts," she murmured to herself as she walked off. Elijah turned and walked toward the rear of the cabin, leaving Veronica standing there, feeling the full weight of the consequences of her actions. It wasn't over. In fact, this was just the beginning of a much bigger reckoning for her, and for the company that had turned a blind eye to her behavior. As he reached the door to the galley, Elijah looked back one last time, meeting Grace's eyes. She had been a quiet observer throughout the whole ordeal, and her expression now conveyed a silent acknowledgement. Grace knew the game had changed. The storm Elijah had set in motion was far from over. Veronica's position was no longer secure, and soon everyone on that plane would see that no one, not even the people in first class, was untouchable. Elijah's eyes followed Grace for a moment, then returned to the tense scene unfolding in front of him. Veronica's unease was palpable, radiating off her in waves as she sat in the galley, her hands now gripping the edge of her seat, her gaze flickering nervously between the door and Elijah. He could almost hear the frantic thoughts racing through her mind. How could she have known? How could she have possibly known that her actions would lead to this? The plane was almost completely emptied, save for the few stragglers who remained in their seats, taking their time to gather their things. But for Veronica, the real waiting game had just begun. Elijah knew that as soon as they reached the gate, the executives, HR personnel, and whoever else had been dispatched to handle this would meet her, face to face. And from the look in her eyes, it was clear she was already anticipating the fallout. As the final passengers began making their way down the aisle, Veronica stood up abruptly, her movements jerky, uncertain. She reached for her uniform with trembling hands, trying to smooth out the wrinkles, trying to regain some semblance of control. But it was too late. She couldn't hide the panic in her eyes. She couldn't escape the impending reckoning. The sound of footsteps approaching the front of the plane made Veronica freeze. Her gaze snapped to the jet bridge as the final few passengers filed off, leaving only the ones who had been watching the show unfold from the back. She knew, instinctively, what was coming. The executives were there. The door of the plane opened, and as Elijah stood up and stretched, he caught sight of the group gathered outside, waiting with an air of quiet expectation. Grace, ever composed, walked past Veronica and toward the exit, casting one last glance back. Her eyes met Elijah's briefly, a silent understanding passing between them. She knew it was over for Veronica. This wasn't just about one misstep. This was about a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. Veronica, her fingers still trembling, stood in place, trying to summon the strength to walk down the aisle. Her uniform felt heavier with every step. She couldn't seem to move fast enough. Elijah observed her from his seat, his expression as calm as ever, the faintest hint of satisfaction curling his lips. "Don't rush it," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. It was clear she couldn't help it. Every step she took seemed to weigh her down more. She was walking into her own downfall. As she passed his seat, he let her feel the weight of his gaze, his eyes meeting hers for one last time. "Good luck," he said, his tone casual, as if he were wishing her well on a simple trip. Her face turned pale, and she looked like she might faint right there on the spot. But she pressed on, dragging herself toward the door, the reality of what awaited her on the other side sinking in with every step. Elijah knew this moment would haunt her long after she left the plane. As soon as the last passenger exited, Elijah stood up, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. He was the last one off the plane. The moment of his exit just as controlled as everything else. He could feel the weight of his actions, the ripple effect they'd had on the flight, and on Veronica's future. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed down the jet bridge. Veronica's world had already started crumbling, and Elijah was just the architect of her downfall. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the group of executives moving toward him, the seriousness of their demeanor in stark contrast to the casual airs of the passengers still milling about. They knew something was off. They knew what had gone down in the first-class cabin, and now they had to deal with it. He greeted them with the same quiet confidence that he had carried through the entire flight. "Shall we go over the details?" he asked, his voice smooth as ever, even though he was about to watch everything unfold in real time. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was only just beginning. And Veronica, she had no idea just how much her fate had already been still running over every detail, underdog, every decision. He had made a point today, an important one. People like Veronica couldn't be allowed to thrive in a system that enabled their behavior, and it wasn't enough to simply remove them from the equation. The whole structure had to be re-examined, reformed. The chime of the elevator as it reached his floor snapped him out of his thoughts. He stepped out and walked down the hallway toward his room. Each step deliberate, his confidence never wavering. Inside, the room was quiet, sleek and modern, with a panoramic view of the city that stretched out before him. But as he took a moment to reflect, it wasn't the view or the luxury of the space that satisfied him. It was the control, the knowledge that he had taken something broken and forced it to bend, to change. As Elijah slipped into a robe and settled into a chair by the window, his phone buzzed once more. This time, the notification was different, more personal. It was from Grace. The message was brief, but it was clear. "Thank you. I won't forget." He smiled to himself. Grace was someone who would remember, someone who would do things right when others hesitated, and that was why he'd paid her attention. She had something Veronica lacked: integrity. He opened his laptop and began to sift through emails, finalizing a few details on upcoming business ventures. But as the city lights twinkled below, Elijah felt an undeniable sense of accomplishment. Not just because of the victory today, but because the game had changed. Tomorrow, the world would know what happened on Flight 247, but what they wouldn't know, what they could never know, was how carefully Elijah had orchestrated every move. How, with just one flight, he had not only secured justice for himself, but had also sent a message to anyone who dared cross the line. Respect isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. The clock ticked forward, and Elijah Carter, always one step ahead, finally allowed himself to exhale. Tomorrow, the world would remember. But for now he was content.